And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. As great to have John Waters back with us again. John, thank you so much for coming on today and joining us.
Thank you for having me on, Peter. It's a great pleasure.
Great to be with you. And it was certainly about a year ago. And I actually reading your Substack, which I think prompted me to reach out, and your book, The Abolition of Reality, a first draft of the end of history. And there's the front cover of it. All the links are in the description. You can get it on Amazon, hardback, paperback, and ebook on Kindle. And it's a fascinating read, as if you follow John's Substack, you will know that the writing style is really easy to understand, easy to read, with prose, with poetry, with what you'd expect from an Irish writer, basically. So really enjoyable, a lot in it. But maybe the first thing I want to ask you, John, is one of the first lines, before we get into, and it's a collection of your Substack articles from 2020, 2024, looking at that COVID time. And there are a lot of things I'd just like to pull out and to get your thoughts on, because I can't do the book justice. But actually, very beginning, before chapter 1, there was a line in it, and each year you give the chronology of that year with a breakdown of what's happening before you go into the chapters covering that year. But one of the lines before then is 15th of August 1971, US abolition of the monetary gold standard. And I find that really interesting. A book that's about control, about the power of media, the power of propaganda, and what people did, the role of governments, the role of farm, all of that. Actually, you go back decades and you use this line about the gold standard. Maybe let us know why you put kind of that line in, which maybe doesn't seem to connect to the topic.
Well, you see, this is the thing, Peter, that the topic is, what is the topic? Well, the topic, this word COVID, which immediately short circuits you into some kind of medical saga. But I've been saying for some time that COVID was not about COVID, that COVID was really about everything else except COVID. It was really an attack on the human race. And for a particular reason, in particular, to do with, as I say, it wasn't about your health, it was about your wealth, much more. And that's where the gold standard connection begins to make sense, because, that connection, which was, between human endeavor, human labor, human work, human creativity, and gold, had it in it a kind of equilibrium, that the scarcity of gold, the difficulty of mining gold, and so on, somehow, reflected more or less approximately the difficulty of making things, of creating things, of producing things. And so that was a necessary kind of ballasting, as it were, of the two functions of the money and the work, and the getting out of bed in the morning. That there's that kind of sense of that connection. And when that was abolished, then you had a kind of the result was a kind of a free floating money, or quasi money, because it wasn't really money anymore, because it didn't have any root, that's the anchor of money. That was the gold. That was the reason gold. Gold has no intrinsic value of its own as a substance. It's just it's a metal. Of course, it has now. If you find gold, you're going to be rich. But why is that? Well, it's because of that connection, fundamentally, and But objectively speaking, gold is just another form of rock. But that was the core of the human economy, and as a result of that, of human existence and coexistence. And once that connection was severed, we were into a kind of a situation where economics became more or less about gambling, about stock markets and bond markets, and people could make a lot of money without actually doing anything useful, or even getting out of bed in the morning. You didn't have to get out of bed anymore. You could just tippy tap on your laptop and make a couple of minutes and go back to sleep. And that really destroyed the world. And then out of that came this whole idea of fiat currencies and debt, created as a debt as a creator, as an instrument of creating wealth. where that the way that wealth was created, that somebody went into a bank and borrowed money. That became then an asset of the bank, a liability of the person who had borrowed it. And this was how the world began to operate. And of course, that created a ballooning of debt because by definition, intrinsic to the whole model was the fact that there wasn't going to be enough money to pay back all the debt with the interest. And this just ballooned. And now we have our economies really weighed down with debt, like just massive ballooning debt that is unsustainable. And, very often I hear people, and sometimes what appear to be very qualified people, saying, "Oh no, it's okay. They can just keep printing money." But of course, if they could do that, money would have no value instantly. If the idea got around that you could do that, and people started believing it, then they wouldn't believe in money anymore because it would be just your toilet roll in the bathroom would be more valuable. So. That's kind of the connection. But where this really comes in to land in relation to the COVID project. That's, by the way, that phrase was created by the World Bank as the descriptor of of what was going on. The COVID project. They didn't say, save the people. They didn't say, deadly disease. It said the COVID project. So it was an economic project, and also it was a military project as well, which is under a different heading, but quite connected. So, I think that on the 15th of August 2019, BlackRock, the world's biggest asset management company, you could call them other things too, but that's what they call themselves, right? And they sent out a letter to the Federal Exchange in the United States, to the World Bank, IMF, the G20, etc., interested parties, saying the world economy is about to collapse. We need to take it down very gently and put it in cotton wool and keep it safe for a little while we prepare our exit strategy, because their imperative was to ensure that none of their clients lost even a cent of their wealth. Whereas what happened to the world was, if anything, not even secondary importance. It was way down the list. And that's kind of been the color, the tenor of the entire COVID project from then on and for the past 5 years. And of course, it still goes on. It is not completed until the landing of those currencies, which is, I call, the supernova of currencies, where they're basically going to implode. And, then you will wake up one morning and all the money you have at the bank will actually be worth less than the toilet roll in your bathroom. That's the general idea as I see it. Now, it may not come out exactly like that, but that's in general where we're going. And of course, that's what everything else is now about. All of the introduction of tyranny, which is really a rehearsal for the real deal when the people realize that they've been robbed of everything they ever had. They're not going to be very pleased. And that's when you will have martial law. That's when you'll have then. It is suggested the mass migration will come into its own as well. We'll begin to see why exactly they were importing all these military-aged men into our countries in Europe and in the West generally.
Oh, yeah. They're also really I think journalists, especially, have tried to rewrite the history, and they've tried. We see now stories on the impact, the destruction of COVID, especially on the health side, and they've tried to rewrite themselves, saying, "No, I was really concerned. I spoke about this earlier on." But actually, what you've put together is really fascinating, because your foresight is the same as your hindsight. That's extremely rare.
Yes. Well, I think it's an instinct, Peter, you see, which I thought everybody had. This this was the shocking thing. Like, when I heard back in April 2020 that, and people misremember, this has been rewritten as well, this particularly. Remember the thing about what they told us, well, you can't go any more than 2 kilometers from your own home. That actually wasn't what it was. The actual regulation, if you can call it that, whatever it was, law, probably not, but makey uppy stuff. Uh, what it said was that you cannot leave your home at all except with a reasonable excuse. and then you can only go 2 kilometers, right? That's a rather different matter. These guys are telling, who have no authority whatsoever to tell you such a thing, are telling you that you can't leave your house. They're putting you under house arrest, even though you haven't done anything, even though they haven't charged you with anything. And I said, you can't do that. It's obvious you can't do that. And I met up with my friend at the time, Jim O'Doherty, who uh, agreed with me, and we said, well, let's put in a case about this. Now, to be honest with you, Peter, I kind of wasn't. I did think it was absolutely the right thing to do, but boy, was I not looking forward to facing those awful judges on an issue, because I knew they'd all been bought off by then. I got that distinct impression, and so, but I said we have to do this because to put down a marker, and to, as it were, dramatize what happens so that people will actually absorb it and understand that this is not normal. And that, in other words, we anticipated that the treatment of our case would not be normal either, and that we would be given the runaround, and that we were for 2.5 years. A case that one judge sitting alone could, reviewing our submissions initially and just flicking through them in about like 3 or 4 minutes, could either have said aye or nay, and that would be the end of it. We'd have said, "Look, your papers aren't up. Your case isn't. It doesn't stand up, or whatever." And we couldn't. There's not. Go home and have another go, whatever. But he didn't do that, and he kicked it into the stand. And as a result of that, it took 2.5 years, something like 30 hours of court of time, all 3 layers of court. That's the High Court, Court of Appeal, and Supreme Court. No less than 13 judges, and probably several Amazonian forests, uh, and at the end, the Supreme Court, 7 judges, all seven, no, 6 out of 7, one actually found in our favor, said you can't have a judicial review of this because we say so, right? And the guy who dissented was probably the best judge in the Irish system for the previous 100 years. He had written all the textbooks, so he probably, in a certain sense, I felt that was a victory morally. Ireland used to really be into the moral victories one time when we were playing football. I mean, you lost only 3-0 when it could have been 4. That was a moral victory. Well, I regarded that as a moral victory, that the Jared Hogan was his name, that the best judge in the system for the previous whatever number of years had actually found in our favour. But the actual result was very much against us. So yeah, but to go back to your actual point, I thought
But
everybody.
because I think it's chapter 4, as I was looking for it, called "A New Kind of Stupid," and in that you talk about getting abuse from cyclists, shouting things at you,
Yeah.
and you're obviously, and you make the comment, you're more recognisable face and person than Gemma, so you seem to have suffered that, but also about people coming to you privately and saying, "No, thank you for what you're doing." But it's a bit weird whenever you go out and are getting abuse from strangers simply for fighting for their rights.
Well, exactly, but it was completely, obviously, it was completely Pavlovian. In other words, just programmed, and you could actually detect it in the ebbs and flows of events. That if there was a sudden discussion about some aspect, or some lurching of in some new variant or whatever, they would immediately become more and more exercised. It was quite interesting. Like we had where we live, we had the first week in the lockdown, they actually put a cycle lane right opposite they closed half the road down and put a new cycle lane right there. Like, this is the first priority, like when at the beginning of the lockdown. And these guys are whizzing up at, like, I don't know, like, it seemed very fast. I don't know how fast cyclists can go, but these guys were going pretty fast. And it was like a racetrack. But when they would see me, they would speed up, and then they would let fly with their payload of expletives in my direction. And I kind of, after a while, didn't really take much notice of it. But it was Pavlovian, and the whole thing was so orchestrated and so, nasty, and deliberately so. Like, it was engineered to be nasty, because that was the whole way. In a certain sense, we went to court and it was about law in one sense, but really, most of this stuff wasn't even law. It was pretend law. And there's a chapter at the end of the book where uh, I call it a satanic playground, where I actually talk about the weaponization of the play instinct of human beings. And the way I explain that is that, like, you think about it, like, there's something like it's hard play is hard, and games, these things are hardwired into human beings and into animals, actually, for that matter. It goes right back. It's about the most basic sort of instinct, it seems, that we have. And children, from a very early age, start to play, and they love games and so on. Now, but you think about it, like when you were kids, like you get a new game for Christmas, and it's arcane and obscure. You don't know what you have to read this little booklet and figure out what the parts are for and all that. And everybody sits around the first night and they do a kind of a dress rehearsal, and everybody does an argument about the rules. But the thing about the rules is that they don't belong in the other world, in the outside world. They're about the game and purely about the game. So you have to obey those rules, and you can't bring the logic of the outside world in and say, well, this contradicts these rules. They're not reasonable. And that's what they did. They managed to weaponize that kind of, what you might call, that particular reflex in humans, whereby they would accept something in a game that didn't make any sense. So, and the way when I'm talking about this now, I talk about, well, take, for example, a game in which you have to enter into a room, wearing a face covering, yes? And when you're crossing the room, you have to continue wearing the face covering. But if you sit down, then you can take the face covering off. And if you take, if you want to go to the bathroom, then you have to put it back on again and walk to the door, and then you come out. But if you want to go to the bar, okay, that's now you can take it off then. But you can, when you're drinking, you take it off, and then you put it back on again. So you kind of have to almost like keep putting it up and down. So all of these are the rules of this game, which obviously sounds completely crazy and daft. If you think of it as a game, you say, what would be the point of that? Well, now we know what would be the point of it, and we actually did it, or most people did it for them at just the click of their fingers, and that's kind of, so there's many sinister aspects of this. If you think about, again, that game thing, the dancing nurses, which was, that these hospitals were overrun, they told us. We knew they weren't, because people were going in with cameras and they couldn't find anybody. But then suddenly these videos started erupting of dancing nurses, and not alone dancing, but carrying like blow up coffins, and dancing with the coffins on their shoulders. And you think, this is a burlesque. This is like, and so this was a dark thing. And yet all this happened without people realizing how dark it was. It was as if, as I say, they were in the game, and everything that was within the game had to be observed. And there was no room for dissent. And where there was dissent, then the dissenters were attacked. In the game, there's a guy called Huizinga, who wrote a book about the games back in the 1930s. It's a very interesting book. Homo Ludens is the name of it. And he talks about the two figures in the game who are anathema, in a certain sense, of the game. There's the cheat, and then there's the spoil sport. And he actually makes a very interesting point that the spoil sport is much worse than the cheat, because the cheat still wants to play the game. He wants to win the game at all costs, but the spoil sport wants to spoil the game. And that's exactly how we were treated when we started to try and question anything. That's what the Lycra Lodge were saying, is that you're a spoil sport. That's what they were really telling me. You're a spoil sport. Our game, you're interfering with our game. This is a game. Can't you understand? Are you stupid? That was the vibe, because there was no sense in which people would say to you. Only one person really that I met who kind of obviously disagreed with me came up to me in the street and tried to kind of say to me, well, what are you trying to do? What is your point? What is your point? And I started explaining to him that it's about freedom, and he didn't understand what I meant. He didn't. Like, he said, I don't know, and he walked away, scratching his head. So it was a bizarre kind of logic, which was accepted uncritically by virtually everyone.
And one of the rules of the game was at 6:00 we sat round our screens to see what latest information would be given, those press conferences, and in chapter 1 it's the COVID panicdemic and you scamdemic in the first line. So it's like you don't know what's happening, but you talk about the process of mass entracement and entrapment, I guess, by the media, that left many people terrified and waiting to hear what the latest information was. And obviously at the beginning you realized the power of the media to actually tell us what to think, why to think it, how to think, and to give us the latest kind of fear level so we knew how to actually carry out our lives that day until the next press conference.
Yeah, well, the media was really the most disgraceful thing. In a certain sense, you would have to say the media were the worst of all in this particular sense, that if they didn't behave as they did, none of this would have been possible in the first place. It couldn't have lasted for any more than a week if the media hadn't been completely behind it. And if the media had done the job of investigating or just putting up alternative viewpoints and analysing things properly, then the politicians would have had to fold their tents and go away. But they obviously, what happened was that the media were bought off, and instead they were invited to flip their model from attempting to tell the truth on a daily basis to basically telling lies all the time. And they agreed to that deal. And then they began to kind of see this as a kind of a virtue of theirs, that they were saving lives. But then when there was no lives to be saved, in 2020 there were no excess deaths, contrary to their expectations. But in 2021 the excess deaths started in earnest, and suddenly they lost all their interest in saving lives, and they started to make up all kinds of nonsense about why people were now dying who had, at levels, that were unprecedented, orders of magnitude beyond what would have been a crisis in a previous era. And suddenly, we were now being told like that, oh, gardening is bad for your health. It could give you strokes and heart attacks. And particularly if you let the dirt get under your fingernails. It's really bad. Apparently, that's the real cause of death. You know what I mean? This sort of nonsense, and they put this out with straight faces. And absolutely, scurrilous. But you see, this is the thing about media, and that whole kind of period was that people bought into their they bought into everything that they were told. And it's absolutely shameful what's happened. The indoctrination of the public, the terrorization of the public. There's a very interesting book which came out. I had written a chapter to this effect an article in my Substack, which I didn't make it into the book because I wasn't happy with it. But the book is very interesting. It's called, by Dr. Michael Neals, called The Indoctrinated Brain. And he talks about that session, or seance that you might call it, at the 6 o'clock news or the 9 o'clock news, where he talks about it in terms of that the human brain, when it's tired, has huge difficulty in taking in new information. It's so late in the evening. It's not a good time to be taking in new information. And what he says is that the effects of that is to create that they were essentially imposing early onset Alzheimer's on whole populations, because they were forcing them to take in this information. And the consequence of that, he says, is that you start to erase parts of your memory in order to accommodate this new information. And he says a similar thing happened as a result of the vaccines with the brains. So, what was going on wasn't, it was protocoled, it was scripted. It wasn't like it didn't come from the genius of journalists, let's put it that way. That they were basically following orders, and they didn't necessarily know what they were doing all the time or why they were doing it. But somebody sure knew, and somebody had written those protocols and written those scripts in order to achieve a certain outcome. And that outcome is ongoing. I mean, you can see now, there's all these kind of involutions in relation to media and the way they worked. One of the striking things about it was that you could notice that there had been a radical change in the way that information was being received by the public, and that had something to do with the way that the presentation of information was being altered. And I'll give you an example. It's just like, that they I think that I probably hadn't realized really fully how we take in information from media, because we kind of think, well, no, I just saw it on the news or I saw it in the newspaper. But in fact, when you look back on it, you realize that actually, of course, a critical aspect of this is repetition. Reinforcement of a certain message or a certain story. Like if you only see an item on the 6 o'clock news and it's not on the 9 o'clock news, you tend to forget it. Well, it mustn't be true or whatever. It's not important. But they could prioritize certain stories in people's consciousness by treating them in a certain way, and not prioritize them in other stories by just simply reporting them in a way that would give them deniability in the future, and yet not in a way that people would sort of clearly remember, other than that, well, I thought I saw something about that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's vaguely, yeah, yeah, I think I do. Yeah, I know what you mean. But, so it's a lot of kind of tricks that journalists didn't make up because they'd never done it before. But they were operating these protocols in ways that had fiendish outcomes, regardless of whether they knew what they were doing or not.
And in one of the early chapters, you talk about the ideological stripe of COVID, where there's you give some of the stats of the 10 worst states for fatalities. Democratic states in the US accounted for in the region of 13 times the number of deaths as Republican-led states. And I was thinking, well, actually, you could have titled that chapter maybe "Death by Stupidity," but you do stupid in your chapter 4. But it was strange to see that, and yet in the UK we had a supposedly conservative government, but they went full down control and taking away all our freedoms. But that kind of divide between right and left, or conservative and on the left, we saw that all across the world, really.
We did, yeah. We did. That was the strangest thing about it at the very beginning, because I remember the emergence of various previous pandemics or epidemics, or whatever you call them, and which would tended to come and go, and pretty quickly. Like the first SARS thing went in 2009. That disappeared in a matter of like a week or so. But and for a moment I thought that's what was going to happen here, but it didn't. And I kind of started to wonder about this, because I remember being in the newsroom and going to news conferences, and when I was with the Irish Times, for example, or other media, and there was always going to be, a lot of, I suppose, a good number of young journalists who mightn't be all that kind of, but there'd be a kind of lot of hard-bitten old chals, at the back, like, who had seen it all and who weren't going to listen to any nonsense. But they seem to have lost their tongues in this whole episode, or to have been excluded. I don't know exactly how, because there was no common sense emanating from the media at all. It was almost as if there had been some kind of mandating issued against common sense, that people were advised, whatever you do, don't say anything commonsensical. Just nod your head at and no matter how ridiculous what you hear is, just nod your head. That was kind of like, and then we'll put it in the paper tomorrow. And that's what happened, and that's what still happens. And so journalism is over now. I was a journalist for 35 years. I remember as a child, the word journalist used to excite me. The word, to hear a journalist speak or to read, it was like it's almost like a godhead. It was a really exalted position, and now I'm ashamed of the word. Like I kind of, when people introduce me as a journalist, I say, sorry, do you mind? And I've said to my wife, that if in my obituaries I'm described as a journalist, she's to immediately ask for a correction and clarification the next day.
There was another early on, one of the chapters was the break for evil. And this is intriguing, your thinking on this. And a few lines from the chapter, I call it the break for evil. By evil, I mean that as though in a single instant, perhaps precisely traceable in retrospect, the authorities of the Western world all at once began to shift from the right foot of good authority to the sinister hooves of wickedness, violence and coercion. I mean, break in the sense of running for the border as though they had seen their opportunity and made a run for it. It was as if they were kind of held back until this moment, and then just suddenly were desperate to do other countries out in terms of restricting freedoms. Yeah. And there was a race to see who could take away more of our freedoms than another country.
Yeah, and the lockstep nature of that, Peter, was really astonishing, because we'd never witnessed that before. You know what I mean? Like, you know, and that told us that there was some supranational authority at play here, because we knew that our own incompetent governments couldn't get it together to, put, those chalk men that you had on the paths in the parkways in the park. And so that would have taken them about 2.5 years to get that sorted out, and the yellow posters another year, like, so, but these things happened overnight, and it was quite extraordinary, and there's an image I use in that as well, in that chapter, I think, about the crows, that the whole world, it was like, if you're watching in a field where the crows land in the evening, and they all gather out there, and then they fall silent, and then, without any audible signal, they just whoosh, they take off. And it was like that, and of course, appropriately, a group of crows like that is called a murder of crows. Well, this was a murder of humanity, uh, because that's what it was about fundamentally. Because, when people said about, the excess deaths, and these would be the measure. Well, in 2020 there was no excess deaths, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a spike of deaths. There was a spike of deaths in from late March to early May, peaking in the middle of April, and that was all in the nursing homes, where, as a result of stress, uh, misuse of sedatives, and ventilators, many people died who wouldn't have died maybe for weeks or months later, elderly people. And that seems to have been a calculation within the model that they were working in order to push the numbers up and keep the scare factor going.
There was another chapter, the victory of bondage, and I just want to touch on all different areas in it. And that was the end of 2020. And there's a line, it's a quote in it from someone else. The time of COVID has revealed to us something we would not have believed about our fellow human beings, that many of them are happier in slavery than in freedom. And there seemed to be a safety or a security in that kind of slave mentality of having all our freedoms taken, and the more freedoms that were taken, the better off we would be. And then the whole thing of people, the curtains twitching of neighbours if they dare have out for a cup of tea, then to report on them. And that seemingly happiness or security in all our freedoms being gone.
Yeah, I think that was a very noticeable thing. And since, I don't know if I'd included this point in the book. I don't think I did, actually, but it has struck me recently that actually maybe there's something about the modern way of living that creates such stress and anxiety for people that they welcome some kind of break like that, where they can become infantilized and throw all of their power away and sort of give themselves over to some tyranny, so that they can be told what to do. And it's a little bit like being back in school again and just taking instructions from teacher. And that, the fear of responsibility, the fear of getting things wrong, the tiredness you feel of pushing with your life, and always just about at best, hanging on, hanging in. I think there's certainly something in that there's something in the modern mentality, in the modern lifestyle, that makes us very susceptible to interventions like that, which sort of say, well, and it is like, in a certain sense, the bondage in multiple senses, because, obviously bondage in the sense of slavery, but also bondage in the BDSM sense, where there's a kind of almost that sort of master sub relationship between the people and between the politicians and the people, who, the politicians crack the whip, like, and, the people just kind of shiver and get on with it, and I think there's a lot of dark forces there, and of course that brings us then to the darkest forces, which is that the idea that all of this is at some level what we call satanic, whatever that might mean to people. For what it means to me is that it's basically that there is a tendency of more and more people in power, particularly, to place their trust in dark forces rather than in forces for good, because it's easier like that. You can actually take a shortcut to wealth, to power, and you don't have to obey any rules, really. The rules are for your subjects. And I think that that's something that, is part of this sort of spiritual war, very intrinsically central to this spiritual war that we've been fighting, because ultimately that's what it is.
No, it's right. And there were many things I took from from the book that I had no idea about. And when I've been through it, my thought at the end was, I need to make sure I read all of John Waters' Substack, because sometimes you read here and there, but you realize there's so much packed into it. So that's kind of my line to the viewers: read more of what John puts out. But you said here, in a related point to one I've repeated, concerning the preamble of the 1937 Constitution of Ireland, which begins, "In the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom as our final end all actions both of men and states must be referred, we the people of Era, humbly acknowledging our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ." And then talk about when God is abolished, what goes in. He is replaced by all. He is not replaced by all men, but by a few men imposing their will on the rest. How does this fit into kind of that removal, and not just Ireland, but much of the Western world, that removal of acknowledging the divine, of acknowledging who God is, to actually thinking we are God ourselves, and then being controlled by a smaller and smaller group at the top, really?
Yeah, well, there's a point. I mean, and what I'm going to say now isn't in any sense kind of, an attempt to downplay the importance of any particular religion or religion as a thing. But, you know, much more in this context, in a certain sense, much more important than the question of God is the question of emphasizing to each and every human being, you are not God. You are not God. So the real danger here is not forgetting about God in itself. It's what happens next, which is that you then replace God with yourself. You place God you place yourself on God's throne in your own life, if in the normal things, and that is a syndrome which within Alcoholics Anonymous is recognised, and one of the primary causes, where you take on the burden of everything in your life. You have nobody to refer it to any longer, because you've abandoned God. You've kicked God off the throne, but now you find yourself with all the responsibility of God and none of the power. So but then in the public arena, when people start to then they begin to believe that they're God, and they begin to create structures which make them feel more and more godlike. And of course, that's a very, very dangerous thing. I in the Constitution of Ireland, that I've often said it to people, that preamble, those first over, in the name of the most holy Trinity, the purpose of those is to take the rights of the people and hold them upwards towards heaven, as it were. Maybe not as it were, as it is. Okay. And in doing so, fundamentally, apart from what the other meanings of that, you are actually holding those rights out of the reach of tyrants. And when you actually look at what's happened in the law courts in the context of the way that judgments over the recent decades have gone in respect of uh, things like natural law principles, the language of the constitutions, the fundamental absolutist language that's inalienable, imprescriptible, antecedent, anterior, all those words which were almost like as close to 100% absolute as you could imagine. Maybe having some minor possibility for flexibility in particular extreme cases, but always cases which were to do with particular situations. Never to say all the people will lose their rights now for the foreseeable future. That was inconceivable by the logic of those constitutions and that language. And the judges reinterpreted this language and issued judgments that were watering this down all the time and saying, oh no, well, the words are they're there, they're interesting, but they're not really intended to be this or that or the other. So what you realize with listening to these judgments over the last few decades is that these judges were basically saying anything that came into their heads, and putting it into their judgments without taking any responsibility either for the consequences or for the intentions of the framers of the Constitution and all the discussions that had gone into the formation and the formulation of those paragraphs, those articles in that Constitution. So that's where we are, and we've seen this in in virtually every country, I would say, in the West, where, no, they now tell us that, there is no absolute right to life. They tell us that the unborn child is not a human being. They tell us all this stuff, which has no basis in anything, in anthropology or in metaphysics or in philosophy or anything. There's no logic to it other than made up stuff. And that now is believed by people who want the easy life. And and that is satanic. That is the definition. That if you go down the road of finding an easy way to go through existence, then you're basically playing it by the devil's rules.
What was your thinking pulling these Substack articles together? Is it I mean, you show the power of groupthink throughout it, and there are 3 chapters of groupthink. So you're showing what has happened and doing a public record of that, but also it's a warning for the future. And if this was so successful up to now, imagine what can happen in the future. Now people know. I mean, because there's a lot here. You could have just left on your Substack, but you want to publish as a book. Kind of how exactly that maybe
Oh,
should have been my first question, John. I don't
you,
know, but to finish off, how did it come together and why?
okay. Well, actually, it was my publisher, Joseph Dindinger in Texas, who was reading my articles and said, "We have to put this in a book." And I said, well, yeah, be my guest. I want that because I don't believe in the internet. I've never have believed this idea that if it's on the internet, it's there forever. It's only on there as long as the guys in charge want it to be there. And you can wake up tomorrow morning, and everything is gone if they want that. But also because I love books. I don't mean that in any kind of sentimental way. I've grown up with books, and I just think that when you have a book, it's an extraordinary resource to have that and know there's words in it, and and so I had this idea that, first of all, rereading 1984, Orwell's book, and I came across that section where Winston Smith has got his beautiful new notebook, and he wants to start a diary, and he's hiding in the alcove away from, he thinks, from the telescreen where he can't see him, and he's starting to write, and then he stops and asks himself, well, who is this for? And he said, for the future, for the unborn, he says. And I thought, yeah, that's what it is. And I had this idea that, if I could get people to buy a book and read it, obviously, and then when they're, maybe you buy 2 and keep 1, but do 1 like this and wrap it in cellophane and wrap it in brown paper, maybe tinfoil, and then put it in a cardboard box and put that in a plastic bag, and then hide it in the rafters of your house, so that in 70 or 90 or 120 years, somebody will be up there doing some work with the slate, and they will find it and they will read it. Because the great fear I have had from the beginning of this was that the devilish techniques that they were applying to the people now, the behavioral psychology and the propaganda tools and the groupthink thing and all those, that were so badly understood in our culture. And I went to great lengths then to dig out all I could find to explain these concepts to people so they would know them and recognize them again. And uh, and I wanted to have a book that in the future people would be able to read it and say, well, oh, so this society we now live in, let's say, if it goes down the road that the tyrants want, it's not the only natural way that human beings should live. Something happened to make this happen. Perhaps we could reverse it. Perhaps we could go back and find another way of living that isn't so tyrannical, isn't so cruel, And that's what I think. I think because and that sounds like a very fundamental, basic kind of thing, and it seems almost like a hyperbole in a sense. I know, because why? Because I'm uttering it in a normalized context, in a certain sense. I don't mean here between you and me, but in the general world that there's now, that has been these crimes are being covered up by journalists. There's a sense of normalization of the extreme and the surreal. And I want to basically be able to remind people that this is the worst, the most heinous crime in history. What has happened here? It is not a small thing. It is not the overreach. It is not these guys being so anxious to save our lives that they did a bit too much, went a bit too far. No, 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 no. This is appalling beyond imagination. And we need to understand that this can never happen again. If we can get out of this, then we have to create conditions that, that it never happens again, that everybody is educated in these things, that we understand immediately when we see somebody pulling one of these tricks that we say, yeah, yeah, get off now, get off now. That's what we need to do. And I think, and I have said it repeatedly, that all of this, the institutions of our societies need to be dismantled after this, including the media. And the media closed down and their buildings razed to the ground, like remember those people, the two murderers, husband and wife, was it the Wests? Their house was knocked down as a mark of respect to their victims. Well, I think the same should happen to the Irish Times and RTE and the BBC and the Guardian and all those newspapers who pushed these lies and pushed this bullying campaign against the human race for those years, and have left us now absolutely demoralized and destitute and heartbroken. Many of us, maimed for life, and many people having lost people that shouldn't have lost. All this, and then they say everything's fine. Everything's fine. Oh, by the way, there's a new variant. That's covering up the crime. And these, Peter, these are the same journalists in Ireland, certainly, who lined up to attack the church, the bishops, for covering up the crimes of priests. Rightly so at the time. But okay, can we now point the finger at them and say, you are the guilty one here?
Oh, yeah, and you talk about it. The crime of having mass was one of the many crimes of individuals. Just my last thought on emotion, because you use a rich tapestry of language to present it, and that makes you think. But it would be too easy, very easy, I guess, to move over into anger, because there is sheer anger from all of us, what has happened.
Yeah.
But that doesn't come out, and you're able to tell a story to pull people in of a horrendous time in our history, and yet not go over into this shouty anger, frustration. I think that's I'm just wondering for yourself, how do you put that down? Because your first reaction is maybe anger, but actually you put it in a way which that doesn't come across, and I think that really connects with the audience.
I think that's a very, very interesting question. I hadn't thought about that, but I guess it's something to do with, sitting down and saying, okay, there's a story here. How am I going to tell this story? What is what is the scaffolding of this story? How do I construct it? And then you go off and you start to kind of find channels of understanding of the subject, whatever it might be. You say groupthink. Well, what is known about groupthink? Who came up with the term? You know, uh, what did he say or she say? What books can I find about groupthink? Very few, actually. And I kind of try. What I wanted to do in those three chapters was conscious of the fact that the subject of groupthink was kind of so important and yet had been kind of neglected and or incompletely dealt with. I wanted to create a kind of more or less comprehensive analysis of groupthink so people would know know it when they saw it, because there's a very important aspect of groupthink, which is the in group. People, whether it's a room full of people or a hall full of people or the entire human race, that they can be manipulated into a singular way of thinking by a very cunning person using neurolinguistic programming, etc., and made to think in a certain way. And then the most important thing then is that the leader of the group think creates an out group, who the threat of which is destabilizing of the in group, and this actually serves to galvanize the in group all the more against this threat that they will undo their great work, whatever it might be. And so there's this spectre summoned up outside the window of the dark force that is looming. And of course, this is always an imaginary force. In this case, it was the far right. Our societies had virtually no far right. Certainly Ireland has none. The last far right that was in Ireland was the blue shirts in the 1930s, which were the foundational force of the current Fine Gael party, which was the party pushing this tyranny from government buildings. So the only far right in the country was the people in government buildings, and those of us who instinctively knew that can show it historically as well.
Wow. I just again encourage your viewers and listeners, johnwaters.substack.com, the book, The Abolition of Reality, a first draft of the end of history. And anyone who is so highly regarded by Mike Eden, and I read his quotes about watching one of your videos and how impressed he was of how you look through history and present that. Anyone who is so well regarded by Mike Eden is worth listening to. So, John, thank you so much for giving us your time. Fascinating book, and thank you for giving us a slight overview of some of the thoughts in it. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.